talk earlier made a sort of self-deprecating comment about feeling like he was sort of repeating. But you know, what you may not know is that the speakers were not coordinating at all, right? So I'm like, I wonder if someone's just going to say everything I'm going to say. I mean, I doubt it, because I'm basically drawing on personal stuff. But I see this as a good thing because, like I said, we didn't coordinate. So if you detect any themes, it's emergent. It's not a plan. And that's encouraging to me because that means that you know, I'm not just going off in some weird direction on my own. I'm like, okay, Anglo-Ortho, I feel like, you know, well, there might be a fit between what I say and what he says. And, yeah, anyway, well, yeah, we'll see what you think. Okay, so main title of my talk is Don't Panic. I used to keep those words up in my cube at work. So we've inherited a great tradition. A lot of words you can use for it. I like to call it Christendom, probably because I'm a Christian. But and this heritage includes history, ideas, cultural practices, little things like science. You know, our sphere, I would say, is very strong in the area of ideas and history, at least. You know, where ideas I'm including, you know, economic theory, political theory, things like that. So I just want to go in a totally different direction today. I'm going to focus on an aspect of our inheritance that we don't talk about as much, and that's an inheritance of wisdom. And that's because I think that in the end, we'll find that our character and our virtue will be more important than our ideas. Let me defend that idea. If we're virtuous, then we're able to learn and adjust, right? To recognize dead ends, to be open to reconsidering a path we had previously dismissed. With humility, you can let go of an idea or a tactic as situation changes, as you learn, right? Ego becomes an obstacle to that, right? You get attached and you're like, this is my idea, and we got to go with my idea, right? Scott Adams talks about systems over goals. Well, the ancients tell us that the best system of all is Sophia, wisdom, right? So I feel very confident that we are smart and that we are passionate. I have no doubt about that, especially from meeting you guys in person. But are we wise? Jesus said this, O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. A good man out of the good treasure of the heart bringeth forth good things. And an evil man out of the evil treasure bringeth forth evil things. So what will we manifest in the world, right? What will come out of us? So let me illustrate with some family history. I'm going to be a little personal here. So my parents were missionaries to the Jews in St. Louis. Many young people, Jews and Gentiles, became believers in Jesus through their youth ministry, which was called kibbutz. The churches in St. Louis actually didn't want them, these new believers, these recently converted, because they were hippies. And they were afraid that they would sell drugs to their children, which, to be fair, they probably would have. So my father's attempt to plug them into established churches, which he felt biblically was the right thing to do, you know, don't forsake gathering together, right? That failed, so he founded a church. Later, several churches were spun off from that original church, and even later, a few of these churches had bitter divisions and splits. And my parents told me that the Lord revealed to them that these splits trace back to their marriage. Now, why should this be? My father was very orthodox in his doctrine, as orthodox as Protestants get, I guess. My father was very orthodox in his doctrine. He was a careful expositor of the scriptures. He was an outstanding evangelist. He taught new Christians to be evangelists themselves. While conservative in morals and doctrine, the movement he founded was not legalistic. It was vibrant. It was fun. I have such happy memories from those days. Yet, as he confessed publicly later, he neglected his wife and his children. It was, you know, all the ministry, right? And he and my mother would get lost in vicious arguments with each other, where they would forget anyone sitting awkwardly around them, like, and this bore bitter fruit, which the Lord revealed to them. You will know a tree by its fruit. What is in our hearts is what we will manifest in the world. So do we really think that we can nurse hatred in our heart, have an out-of-control temper, be an addict, regularly fall out with the people around us, etc., but produce something good because we have like the right ideas about politics? I mean, I don't think that the things work that way, you know. So, the balance of my talk is to just pass on some things that I've received from some people you've heard of, some people you haven't. I'm twice the age of most of you, a lot of you, I suspect, but I'm not 3 times the age. So let me assure you that this talk is not an attempt to give you my wisdom. I'm merely trying to transmit some wisdom that I've collected over the years. Okay, so let me start with someone you wouldn't have heard of, Steve Miller, but my wife knew very well. Steve Miller is a man who was discipled as a teenager by my mother. Before that, he was in Cuba as a young boy with his missionary parents before, during, and after Castro took over there. So that was kind of interesting. Before we were married, he became an important figure to my wife and I separately, you know, before we were married. And at that time, I met with him weekly for a long time, and he acted as a spiritual mentor. One of the things I remember from our times talking is that he pointed out a pattern to me with some of the great men of God, Abraham, Moses, David, for example. In all these cases, there are years in their life in the desert, so to speak, where they seem to be like an in-between state. They've left home, you know, think of Abraham leaving his, you know, God basically says, I want you to leave your home. You know? They've left home or whatever, but they have not attained the position that we remember them for. And Steve emphasized to me that this period of their lives was not short. It was often like several decades. It's like a good chunk of their life that we don't even think about when we think about their story. So, let me give you a concrete example. David is anointed by Samuel to be the future king of Israel, but he does not actually attain that position until 37 years later. Okay? In the intervening decades, he serves King Saul and his army, marries one of Saul's daughters, becomes best friends with Saul's son Jonathan. But then, David spends 15 years being chased by a jealous King Saul, hiding among the enemy, the Philistines, and it is years after Saul dies, furthermore, it is years after Saul dies before he's recognized as Saul's successor. So try to put yourself in David's head a little bit there. Imagine what David felt in those long 37 years. Like, when would he fulfill his destiny? Would it even really happen? Like, did he even remember Samuel anointing him? You know, the temptation to despair and to doubt the Lord must have been tremendous. But were those decades a waste of time for David and these other men of God? Or were they a furnace where the Lord shaped them into men whom he could use? And it just struck me thinking about what Steve taught me, that it's such a contrast to the youth culture model we have that we're presented with, where like a rock star really shines when he's young, and then he sort of fades away, you know. What's that line? Better to burn up than fade away. Right, anyway. It seems to me the Lord tends to use seasoned men. Kierkegaard, I did not put this in because of Anglo-Orthodox. Kierkegaard said that what the world offers us has a quick payoff up front, but long-term suffering of consequences afterwards. The Lord, on the other hand, asks that we submit to his discipline for a time while the payoff is eternal. Right? So, another, someone who, if anyone's heard of him, tell me, but this is not just a personal friend. Marshall Fritz was a figure in the sort of libertarian world. He was the founder of both Advocates for Self-Government and the Alliance for the Separation of School and State. He would stay with me and later my wife and I when we were married, when he was in town. And I don't know how to put it. People felt he was kind of a saint or something. Anyway, I remember telling him when I was quite young how I was going to like write a book that'd be a manifesto or something. I was jazzed up with libertarian ideas and stuff. And he gently discouraged me. His point to me was that I needed time to learn the difference between good and evil by living it out, right? And this is like Aristotle's point. The virtue and character are developed through long practice, less an idea in our head than a sort of muscle memory, so that when a crisis comes, we just do the right thing out of habit, right? Because we practice virtue. Because of, I wanted to go into something that Heather shared with me. Because of having, for our times, an unusually large amount of children, we hear certain reactions so regularly that we were working on a top 10 together of the things that people say when they find out that we have 8 children. So we haven't gotten all 10, but here's an incomplete top 10 that my wife helped me put together. There are occasional nasty reactions like, it's not a contest, you know. You know how this happens, right? Go ahead and tell them what you say.
Oh, to that I say, yes, and we enjoy it very much. And then they feel embarrassed, as they should.
A few more. Are you done? There's no prize in heaven for having the most kids, you know.
How do they know?
Yeah, right. Are you Catholic? Are you Mormon?
Yeah.
Oh, another one has a road. Wow, followed by an eye roll or a disgusted look. And the most common is not unkind. It's just sort of, you must have your hands full. We've heard that so many times. Well, one that other mothers tend to say to my wife is that she must be so patient. And the implication seems to be that my wife was naturally patient first, and therefore that allowed us to have 8 children. Okay, but that is totally the wrong way around. Okay? Heather does have patience now. But she gained this virtue through the journey, right? And here's what she says. You don't learn patience by avoiding situations that require it. The act of living out your beliefs day to day will change you. Right? Okay, so they say I'm the one who's met everybody, so I am going to name drop. Get ready. I met Eric von Knopf-Ledeen. What a pleasure it was to meet him right at the end of his life. He died a year or two after I met him. And even at his advanced age, he carried something almost tangible with him of the old Europe, the great civilization that World War I destroyed. It is in part meeting him that has made it so easy for me to understand academic agent's point that we are all now products of the ashes of civilization, because I got to meet a man once that wasn't, and I could feel it. It was amazing. A lesson I learned from Knopf-Ledeen was that radicalism and traditionalism can go together, as unlikely as that sounds. He would describe himself as an extreme conservative arch-liberal, or a liberal of the extreme right. He would almost chant, I'm not going to be able to do an Austrian accent, he would almost chant, right is right, left is wrong. It's fair to say that he was not cowed by the left. I just have to tell the story of our first interaction. It was memorable. He gave a speech against democracy. If you know anything about EKL, you're not surprised. He gave a speech against democracy at the Philadelphia Society. Philadelphia Society is somewhere where there'd be like Gertrude Himmelfarb would be in the room or something. You know? It's like neocons and conservatives and classical liberals and stuff. And so I rose to challenge him in the Q&A, because I was young and wasn't all, red-pilled and all these things. I rose to challenge him, citing Mises's point that at least democracy allows for the peaceful transfer of power. He responded, yes, peaceful transfer of power, 1933 Berlin. I'm afraid many on the right, and this is my own personal point here, but it is related to him. I'm afraid many on the right have reacted to the degenerate license of our age, done in the name of liberty, by throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But I don't see personally why the left should own liberty, which, if you haven't noticed, they've explicitly abandoned, like with lockdowns and stuff. Right? They're not like on the side of liberty anymore. And Eric Knopf-Ledeen showed how to harmonize being unalterably opposed to the left. He was radically right in that sense, radically anti-left, committed to our European inheritance of liberty, and being a Christian. He embodied this in a powerful way. And my own view, just to try to recommend him to you a little more, my own view is that Knopf-Ledeen is the man for the hour, and I think we should all be reading him. I think he's really critical for us right now. Okay, someone you probably haven't heard of, Reverend Edmund Ovitz. Back in the 1990s, I was looking to connect to older gentlemen in the libertarian world that were spiritual. So I found out about Reverend Edmund Ovitz, and I wrote to him, an actual pen and paper letter, if you can imagine such a thing. To my surprise, he wrote back, and later he met with me when he was in St. Louis. In fact, it's because of him that I ended up at that Philadelphia Society meeting and met Eric Canolbadina. So, I think he may have been 93 at the time, and he was as sharp and vibrant as ever. It was amazing. Opitz had been involved with the Foundation for Economic Education from the beginning, and he would tell me stories about talking to Mises and Hayek back in the 1940s and stuff, so it was kind of cool, you know. So I wish I could remember the exact question, but I asked him something like, what concerns you the most? What weighs on you, you know? And his answer really surprised me. He said he was concerned that people don't believe in the afterlife anymore. Without the afterlife, there's a loss of responsibility, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. You don't have sort of long-term consequences, right? But also, I know that this orientation seems to actually yield fruit in the real world, for what it's worth. So think of the monks that built so many crucial aspects of European civilization. Somehow an eternal orientation is actually pretty constructive in the here and now. Somehow it works out that way. And perhaps one way we could understand this is the Austrian term of art there, time preference, right? A low time preference means that you abstain from consumption, you build and invest for the future. Well, what could be lower time preference than to have an eye on eternity, right? So it seems to me that part of what I got from Reverend Opitz was to have that long-term view is the right orientation to build, right? Okay, Paul Gottfried. So a little background. I'm not assuming you know all these people, so I'm trying to give a little background. There was a brief paleo-conservative, paleo-libertarian alliance that happened in Murray Rothbard's last years. Hans Hoppe later noted with frustration that the paleo-libertarians would read the books about the classics and the cultural stuff and so on and so forth, recommended by the paleo-conservatives, but the paleo-conservatives wouldn't do their reading. You know? So it didn't last very long. But there was one exception to that. And I know him well, and his name is Paul Gottfried, now editor of the flagship paleo-conservative magazine, Chronicles. He did the reading. I remember talking to him, I was like, oh, so you read Human Action? Yeah, I understood it. It's that hard, you know? Anyway, so I first met Paul at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, a couple decades ago. For whatever reason, Paul blessed me with many hours of one-on-one conversation whenever we were at a conference together. Later, we brought him to speak at Washington University in St. Louis, the big university in my town. In Paul's book, Fascism, The Career of a Concept, he argues that fascism only existed between the world wars and only in Europe. And all the attempts to apply the term after World War II obscure rather than clarify the regimes or movements they're applied to. Okay? I'm starting with something that you can be more sympathetic to, and then I'm going to challenge you more. Okay. So as a reductio ad absurdum, as we all know by now, fascism is watered down to mean something like a bad thing that a progressive right-thinking person such as myself doesn't like, right? I have strong memories from hearing many of Paul's lectures, having many conversations with him, of him smacking down this kind of intellectual sloppiness and laziness. And because we weren't hanging around with leftists, he was usually smacking us down. Right? Knowing history is essential, but don't be anachronistic, treating some historical situation as a simple allegory for our time. I mean, it annoys the hell out of us, right? Well, you guys are just Nazis, right? Well, in what sense are we mid-century Germans? Exactly. Spell that one out, connect the dots for me there. Tolkien said something about allegory, I just wanted to mention this. He said, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. So we don't like it when, for example, the neocons treat situation after situation as 1939 and time yet again to crush the new Hitler of the day. So I would argue we should not do this either. So here's an example. I'm not saying anybody's doing this, but I really dislike Klaus Schwab, okay, and the new global governance regime of the World Economic Forum. But does it help to say that he is a new Lenin or a new Marx, right? Though there are certainly family resemblances we can feel in our bones, and that's why we'd be tempted to say something like that. calling our current globalist technocratic overlords Marxists, I think damages our analysis rather than clarifies it. So the lesson I learned from Paul here that I wanted to share with you is, you keep rhetorical name-calling and meme warfare over here, you know, clearly separated from your intellectual analysis. Because if we don't, we blind ourselves to what we're actually dealing with right now. Right? So learning history is great, but be careful to draw allegories. Okay, Robert Higgs. The great economist Robert Higgs also spent many hours in conversation with me at Mises Institute conferences. Just wanted to share something that means something to me. I'll never forget, I had my dad join me one time. I used to go to the Mises Institute several times a year. But one time I brought him with me to a conference, my late father, and I'll never forget the kind words that Robert Higgs said about me to my father. That was really sweet. One of the things Bob and I share is a strong objection to the U.S. empire, or as I'm still not over it, how funny the term the gay is. The global American empire, I have like a 9-year-old's delight. It's still working for me. I laugh every time. Anyway, so one of the things Bob and I share is an objection to the U.S. empire. I remember once when he was speaking, he simply carefully described the effects of the different types of bombs that the U.S. empire drops so regularly around the world. I mean, I'd read about these things, you know, the bunker buster, the mother of all bombs, and so forth. And he went through several of them, and he described exactly what they do to people and how widespread the damage is. And his cold, precise description of their effects brought home to me how laughable the notion of precision bombing is that the U.S. military tried to sell in the invasion of Iraq, for example. It made it clear that these were lies. You know? There's no way with weapons such as these to spare civilians, and when they try to tell us that, they're lying to us. So one of the things when I think about my friend Robert Higgs is justice, a passion for justice. And so quoting from Bob's beloved translation of the scriptures, the King James, he actually gave a little sort of tribute to the King James, I remember, one time at the Mises Institute. And he said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." All right, Lou Rockwell.
Yes.
It's hard to understand, I'm afraid for younger folks, how heroic Lou Rockwell is, because we just accept that what he built is part of our sort of world. But it was not inevitable by any means. He founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute in 1982, in spite of the explicit opposition of the Koch brothers, those really rich guys, who had basically purchased the rest of the libertarian movement and booted Rothbard out of it. And Mises was viewed as too intransigent and too radical of a figure, so they didn't like it. They wanted someone softer like Hayek. Don't underestimate Hayek, but I understand why they did that. So two things I wanted to share from Lou. One is brief. One bit of advice that Lou gave was to not be too attached to getting credit for your ideas. If you're really focused on success, then you will be glad for the right ideas to win, even if you don't get credit. Really important, right? But it's actually something else that brought Lou to mind for this talk. Someone was once talking to Lou about being, well, this is anachronistic, they wouldn't have used the term back then, black-pilled, right? Because getting red-pilled, as we know, tends to lead to being black-pilled, at least at first. You see the reality of things and you're like, oh my God, we're in trouble. So Lou responded with a kind of an odd question. He said, do you watch TV? Lou advised the young man to stop watching TV. Now, TV itself, media's changed since then, right? TV itself may not be much of a pitfall for young folks today, but listen to his reasoning and see if it applies to anything in our world. So what does the TV do, Lou said? It scours our planet of billions of people, finds the most miserable and degraded thing happening, and you know there's plenty of it in a 7 billion population, right? Finds the most miserable and degraded things happening, and puts that front and center so that it feels like that is what life is. Like all the time, right? Now, complicating the picture somewhat, as we've learned now, the actual misery in the world doesn't seem to be enough. And so sometimes they actually invent misery that isn't really happening, fake news type stuff. But anyway, Lou said, turn off the TV, interact with real people that are around you in real life. Most folks are just living their life. They're not wallowing in the lowest forms of perversion. I'm put in mind of, it's so perverse, right? Our popular culture focuses on politicians and celebrities, which, as we know, are the lowest form of scum, right? The lowest form of scum rise to the top of the world of politics and celebrities, right? So, we're spending all our time, like, learning the details of the lives of pedophiles or something. Why is this good? So how does Lou's advice apply to us in our sphere? So we have a way of putting ourselves into a state of hopelessness, even without TV now, in right-wing circles. And that is to wallow in what my friend Morgoth calls misery porn. Right? We all know the terrible things like the mass ethnic rape in England are happening all the time. And, clearly, we're passionate to work to stop those things as soon as can be done. But until we can take specific action about something, I don't know how good it is to just fill our minds with all the bad things we can collect in the world and just, fire hose them into our brain, right? Instead, we should look around, help our neighbor, do the next right thing, and soon, I think with Lou's advice, you'll find that you aren't so discouraged. Because it's not all bleak, right? Okay, how am I doing? Okay, great. This is going to be short. Okay, so, my parents, despite the flaws I shared with you earlier, which they publicly confessed and acknowledged, so I'm not telling anything on them, they're both passed now. My own parents had a great deal of wisdom, and I'm going to focus on one thing. When I was young, my mother saw in me the same sort of mind that she had. Analytical, able to tear something apart and find what is wrong with it. That's what makes me good at my job, right? So she advised me when I was young that if I wasn't going to become a miserable person, I would need to balance my critical mind with a habit of thankfulness. Later, my father wrote a little booklet on thankfulness that he would hand out to people, and people really liked it. More importantly, he embodied this. He really was a thankful person. He felt blessed. He did not hold grudges or dwell on obstacles and failings. He introduced me to the term good problem, which is a challenge you're running into because things are going well. So just to apply it to something we're all in the middle of, I would think of any organizational problems that we've had around this conference as good problems. So this is an example of applying this kind of thinking, right? So, yes, we'll learn lessons, we'll do better the next time we organize the conference, right? But the main point is that we actually did it. We actually left cyberspace and we're actually together, It's amazing. So this is a hugely exciting starting point, and any difficulties that we had with this conference will either be forgotten quickly enough, or they'll become stories we laugh about as we continue to gather together in the future, right? So these are good problems. As opposed to the problem of like, well, we tried to have a conference and no one was interested, That'd be a bad problem, right? These are good problems we're having. So, I could imagine my buddy Academic Agent, if he was in a foul mood, saying that being thankful is a form of cope. But probably done, thankfulness is not cope at all. Here's how I would define cope. Cope is when you use comforting lies to avoid seeing the harsh truth about reality, right? Matrix, I love the taste of the imaginary steak or whatever, right? That's cope. But thankfulness is to see the good things that really are in your life, for real, despite being in the ashes as we are. Despite everything, right, there's some truly good things. So for me, my wife is real. There she is. She's not an illusion. My children are real, right? And I'm so thankful for them. And all of you are not just fed bots on the internet, or most of you at least. So to be thankful for the truly good things in my life is to build an inner attitude that leads to more good things in my life. Jesus said, "For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away." So I suggest you choose to be people who have. What do you have, right? I have this, and this. I think that'll mean you'll have more soon. All right. Hans Hermann Hoppe. He's notorious in some circles for taking their beloved libertarianism in a right-wing direction, and some people didn't like that. But let me give us some context here. Anyone who knew or read Rothbard should not have been surprised. Rothbard proudly remembered being a part of the old right when he was young, like the World War II, post-World War II era old right. And he was delighted near the end of his life to see hope for a return of a real right instead of the neocons he hated so much. I can tell you, despite some of you maybe having disagreements with Rothbard on this or that, he would have been thrilled by this gathering, I assure you. So, just a little more on Hoppe before I get to sort of what I want to bring to you from him. It's in part inspiration from Hoppe that led me to recently rebrand myself as a medieval anarchist. And this is really just meant to be an attention-getting way of saying I'm a radical decentralist in the way that Hoppe described. We look forward to a world of Liechtensteins, much like the patchwork quilt that Europe was before the modern nation-state started consolidating in modern times, a consolidation that has continued until the absurd endpoint we have now reached, global governance. Right. So anyway, that's just introducing Hoppe. But here's what I want to share. I asked Hoppe once, it's like, what if you could meet that great thinker and ask him a question? I got to ask them questions. So I asked Hoppe once whether he saw in our hoped-for future vanguard a lot of agnostics like him and Rothbard. He said no. He would expect that if there is to be a resurgence of European civilization, it will be primarily composed of Christians. Now, part of the thinking here is simple realism about humans. Murray Rothbard wrote about the inevitability of some sort of religion. He wrote, some religion is going to be dominant in every society. If Christianity, for example, is scorned and tossed out, some horrendous form of religion is going to take its place, whether it be communism, New Age occultism, feminism, or left Puritanism. Right now, I would say that alongside the resurgence of Christianity, we're also experiencing this left Puritanism, which unfortunately has all the main institutional centers of power. But anyway, Paul Johnson in Modern Times, it was really fun reading that book for me. It's from the 20s through 90s, something like that. His history of the 20th century. He's in all these details on, World War II, Cold War, check. And he gets to the end, he says, you know what the big surprise of the 20th century was? The resurgence of religion. Christianity in particular. Because, I don't know if you know about it, but they had this notion called the secularization thesis. And I'm not going to try to defend it, but basically it proposed that secularization was an inevitable result of modern life or something like that. It has not turned out that way in reality. So, I would say, whatever your personal beliefs, it would behoove us to accept what even the agnostic Hoppe acknowledged. Man is fundamentally religious, for good or ill. And we have to think about that as we deal with people, right? Okay, so one final figure who I didn't know personally, unfortunately. I was 4 when he died. Tolkien. I just want to mention briefly, the older I get, the more I realize how deeply he shaped how I think about the world. Through his writings, for me personally, believe it or not, almost his nonfiction writings as much as his fiction writings. I don't know how many people even know he wrote nonfiction. But Tolkien taught me that help can come from unexpected places. And I was thinking about that, and I realized there's an important implication of what he said there, which is that we must be willing to accept help from unexpected places. And I would just point out that might require swallowing some pride. Okay, so what's my point? My title, I don't usually read the titles in my sections, but we've got to do something. That's the title. Okay, so my point is, don't panic. The rush to action can be counterproductive and get you January 6th. That's a hard word to say. But it can also just be a waste of time, right? It can wear us out, discourage us because we're burning through time, energy, and resources pointlessly. The Serenity Prayer says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Or to put it another way, no solution, no problem. One of the virtues I felt so strongly from all these old radicals I had the pleasure to meet over the years was patience. And I mean, from the first one I met, I forget which one of these, Edmund Opens, maybe, I don't know. But I remember like, wow, they have such, they're not panicked. They're calm. There was like a deep calm in all of these people. They were in it for the long haul, and it's worth noting, as I recall, they were all happy people, with the possible exception of Paul Guthrie. But, I'll conclude with the story of Naaman from the Bible. He was a great general of the Syrians, but he had leprosy. He found out that there was a prophet in Israel who could cure his leprosy, so he went to the house of the prophet Elisha. Elisha didn't even come out to greet him. Naaman was a very important person, you understand. Elisha did not even come out to greet him. He sent a messenger, and he sent with a message, and it said, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, your flesh will be restored and you will be clean." So great, simple, right? No, Naaman left in a rage. He said, I thought that he would surely come out, stand, call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot to cure my leprosy. Are not the Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not have washed in them and been cleansed? In other words, I'm too awesome of a guy to do this humble task in a muddy Jewish stream. I'm too important for this, okay? But listen to the words of his servants. Would we all have friends or servants this good? Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more than when he tells you, wash and be cleansed?" So I pray that we will all have the character and virtue to be patient, do whatever is needed, however humble, bearing in mind the words of Jesus, the last shall be first. Thanks. Since I was mostly trying to transmit the thoughts of others, I don't know what we're going to talk about. Any questions or comments? Go ahead, sir.
Who's your favorite?
For some reason, I treasure the memory of meeting Knoll Ledeen. That's particularly, it's not just a name that people would know. It really, it's an experiment. It's an experience that like left a mark on my soul or something, you know. And I was like, because I remember reading once, somebody said, why did we destroy, they were talking about World War I, why did we destroy our civilization? And it was such a cri de coeur, you know. And that didn't really connect with me until I met Knoll Ledeen. And I was like, oh, we really lost something in the 20th century. Because I could feel this man who was, he was born like a bit before World War I, but somehow he carried forward the old Europe with him. And I don't know, it left me with a feeling of grief, of course, for what's been lost, but also treasuring the heritage we have and wanting to value it, wanting to preserve it, restore it to some degree, I don't know, to see what we can do, right? Anyway, so I'd pick on Knoll Ledeen, I guess. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I kind of have a partially just a comment in relation to something you said, and then a cop-out question for that. So you cited your question that you asked to one of the people on your list about democracy and your rush to defend democracy. And I did the same thing, and I was associating this back to the patience that you started off talking about. So I met David Friedman at a conference when I was 4 years younger than I am now.
Yeah.
And I immediately rushed not to ask any questions to learn from this person that I should have been probably learning from. And I immediately went to critique his talk on Iceland, which is what he was there to talk about.
His talk on?
On Iceland.
Iceland, yeah.
Structure we had there, it's his
Right.
thing, right? And I immediately rushed to critique it, and then of course I learned nothing from him at the time. And so I just wanted to say that the patience is something I learned and through a similar step to you. So I've kind of had that in the back of my mind for a long time of like, I kind of like ruined that, chance, that opportunity that I had. Is he worth revisiting? That's my thought now.
David Friedman?
Yes.
I read the, oh shoot, that's not what it's called. Machinery of Freedom?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. He doesn't think like I think, which is strange because programmer, but he doesn't think like I think, so I found that less interesting. If I was going to read something along those lines, like an anarchist type thing that isn't the usual Mises Rothbard or Rothbard Hayek type, Rothbard Papa type stuff, here's something you might not have heard of. It's very small. It's called I forget the name of it. Linda Morris and Linda Tannehill. The Tannehills, Tannehill. Very short, and they were like recovering Randians. So they're in the book. They're basically in dialogue with Ayn Rand, who rejected anarchism, and they're basically defending anarchism against the Randian argument. It is a marvelous book. Even if you're not interested in anarchism or libertarianism or anything, if you read it, I think you would find great benefit. It's really quick.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As the most successful patriarch in the building, if there was one piece of valuable wisdom and advice you could give to young men wanting to become such a patriarch as yourself, what would it be?
I've done it. I mean, that was the point of the speech, right? I mean, I wrote the speech the last minute in the sense of writing down the exact words, right?
So would it just be patience?
But I had been collecting the bullet points for it ever since I knew I was going to speak. Something would come to mind, and I'd write it down, So I just tried to intuitively let these things come up. And so I was really trying to share these things with you because, I mean, I started with the critical point, I think, from my mentor, Steve Miller, which is that it's a long haul to become what we need to become, and that's okay. It doesn't mean nothing is happening, because the thing about getting red-pilled, right, the thing about seeing the horrible things that are going on, the fragility of our system, is to feel like we're in a crisis. And I love what Lambda just said. I'm going to keep repeating this until we all pick it up. We were just on a stream discussing That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. And Lambda said the greatest thing. He said, I think crisis is a myth. And I'm like, what? And he said, well, crisis just seems to mean that they get to suspend the rules and do whatever they want to us. So I think we just need to attack the whole notion of like emergency and crisis.
Yes.
I thought that was really profound. I think we should wrestle with that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say, I guess, is yes, things are dire in many ways, but I think you ought not to treat it as a crisis. God is still on his throne in heaven, etc., right? When it's time for him to call you to do something extraordinarily, you'll know, right? But in the meantime, you've got to become someone he can make use of. Otherwise, that time will come when you're needed, and you won't be there. You won't be ready for it. So that's the weight of my talk. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you. It's very clear that fatherhood and marriage is a very, very important part of your life. I was just wondering if you could give a few words on whether you think the pursuit of marriage and fatherhood is an essential part of a man's development, and if so, in what way?
Well, I have to be a scriptural, biblical Christian, right? Paul said, I wish everyone could be single like me, so be more devoted to the work of God. I would not take a position on that because it depends on the individual's calling, right? I think some people talk about staying single as a gift. Unfortunately, we've got a situation now where family formation is just failing, and I'm not sure that it's such a gift right this moment. But in some cases, at least, and I've known people in my church who stayed single. They were not like upset about it. That is what they were very busy. They were doing ministry. They were called to what they were called to, and they were happy, right? So and they were great people, and they had good character, So I don't think it's necessary to form character, but it can help. Heather.
Oh, I just wanted to add to your response to your question about how one of the things I've known Stephen for 25 years, I think, and consistently what I see him doing is seeking out wiser people than himself, older people, elders in whatever community we're in, and being with them and sitting with them and listening. I remember Stephen met this old blues, jazz pianist.
My teacher. Yeah.
Named Pops.
Pops Porter.
At this music festival in the Cleves Landing in St. Louis. And he walked up to Pops and he said, "Are you a good teacher?" And Pops said, "Are you a good student?" So, are you a good student? Is your heart open? Are you listening? I mean, our dear friend Charles Ford, I mean, Stephen was the only one of our intellectual friend group who consistently met with Dr. Ford until he died. He sat with him until Charles didn't even know who Stephen was anymore. That's the kind of man he is. You know, that's what makes him a good father, a good husband, his willingness to listen, to be taught by people who have gone before him. So I think if you're open, if you're willing to listen, you know, that's what I see here. So.
Thank you.
It seems so, if you're a young person and they're kind of mid to late 20s like myself, the 2008 recession is kind of this unpleasant teenage year memory. I guess since that time, right, we've seen the Federal Reserve just restrict everything in 0.0 interest rates. I guess the concern now is all the secondary effects of the lockdowns are really starting to manifest with businesses. I don't have to list them ad infinitum, but they're almost innumerable. How can we as young people prepare for kind of the inevitable next either inflationary crisis or recession?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, okay, first of all, I always remember, I think it was Burke, someone was talking about, you know, some crisis in the British Empire or something, and Burke said, you know, there's a lot of ruin in an empire. So though I agree with some of the gentlemen this weekend who have said that it feels like our system is rather fragile, that fragility may not result in any collapse for decades, you know, or longer. There's a lot of ruin in an empire. So you know, I wouldn't totally be like in full-on prepper mode personally, because I just don't think you can live your life that way. Having said that, I married a prepper, and so she actually is the one who sort of is really orienting our land to having growing food and having chickens that give us eggs, and, you know. And so I don't think that's terrible. I'm supportive of Charlemagne and other friends who are looking to purchase land and move away from the cities. Yeah. Okay, so here's the other fun thing to know about me. And I don't say this with pride, but just because I think you'll find it interesting. I actually predicted 9/11. But I wasn't the only one. I was, you know, I was in the right circles and I understood what the empire was up to, and I could feel the anger growing and that there would be a reaction, blowback as the CIA calls it. And so the day it happened, the coworker, we were watching it in the break room, and a coworker came by as the planes are hitting the thing, and he says, "You said something like this would happen." But I wasn't the only one. Another friend of mine was pretty clued in. And he moved to Australia. What's interesting about that, prior to 9/11, what's interesting about that is he moved just prior to 9/11, and he was living and working in that area. So his foresight and his preparation could very well have saved his life. So, you know, when you feel that the time bomb is about to go off, then bust a move, right? But I would say that you can't live your life, like I'm saying, you can't live your life in crisis mode, right? We've mostly got to become the people we need to become. Okay, go ahead, sir. You, yes.
What future do you see for decentralization in the face of what I would say is the unfortunate superiority of centralizing forces?
Right, well, AA pretty much spoke my mind on this last night. He said, I think it was AA, right? He said, de facto is what we're looking for, right? Not de jure. It's no time, unless there's a collapse. We're not going to have de jure Texas secession or anything like that. Forget it, right? They're never going to let that happen, officially. Having said that, de facto, on the ground, local decentralization, I think, is not only a possibility, but I think it's a reality. Like the anti-CRT stuff, they're based, you know, in one little tiny way, when those parents get in there and actually get them off the rails on the CRT, they are, you know, you could say that school district has now sort of seceded a little bit in that one dimension, right? I think that's more what it's going to look like. It's going to be sort of little piece by piece, carving out a little bit of local sovereignty, right? And then, you know, ideally when the collapse comes, or if the collapse comes or something, those things just become real. You know, if you want the if we get the Hoppian vision, right? Those localities just go, well, okay, now the central government is literally doing nothing for us, and we don't have to pay attention to it anymore because it's in chaos or it's ignoring us or whatever. So we'll just do our own thing. So for now, de facto, but not de jure. I wouldn't waste my time with Texas secession movement personally. Okay.
Hey, I'm a Hoppa appreciator, and I just wanted to know if you had I want to know if you had any other interesting anecdotes from when you met Hoppa in person.
Oh, I don't know. I would just say he's warmer after some beers. No. He's actually self-admittedly changed over the years from when I first knew him. He's like, I'm a Northern German. We're very, you know. He is now, if you see him speak at the Property and Freedom Society or something, he has self-deprecating humor, and he's just a little warmer and less sort of. He was very just, you know, rigorous and logical, and not just when he was talking, just when you're like talking to him, you know. And he's a little more human these days. So. He's a logic machine. Okay, anything else? Okay, sir.
Yeah, sure. I was actually curious about something. You mentioned Nolpedine. You said you had this...
Mentioned who?
Nolpedine, I'm sorry.
Nolpedine.
Yeah, sorry about that. But you said you had the spirit of kind of old world Europe before, you know, we went into full Gerder Dammering mode after the First World War. And I'm just curious a bit more about kind of what that kind of person is like.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that one word that comes to mind is gentleman. He felt, well, it's something I've noticed a lot. I associate with some of the English scholars I really like, for example. It's this combination, well, it's like a Jesus thing. Well, I'll come back to that. Okay, so it's this combination of, they're very sharp in their thinking and in their words. They're not vague in their thinking, and they're not vague in their speaking. Like Connaught Ledeen, you knew what he was saying, right? You weren't like, I wonder what he meant by right is right and left is wrong. You got it, right? He was extremely clear in his communication, extremely sharp. But he wasn't, he didn't feel, that might make you think that he would feel like off-putting or something, but it was the very opposite. His clarity of mind was combined with being a real gentleman. He was actually nobility, by the way. That's the bomb, right? But you felt that. He was a real gentleman. And, you know, I mean, I was, what, 20 or something? I don't know. I was in my early 20s, and he's in his 80s at this conference with all these important people, and he ends up, like, talking to me, you know? That's what he was like. Anyone else? I think we might be done. Okay, thank you.